Welcome back to CBS Mornings. As President Biden travels to Belgium to meet with NATO members, he says the alliance is more united today than ever before. The reason? Vladimir Putin. This morning, Chief Washington Correspondent, that's Major Garrett, looks at the history of NATO and its many challenges over the decades. He's at the White House. Major, I'm thinking a lot of people could use a little history lesson right about now. You are the perfect person for that. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Gayle. Good morning, everyone. President Biden leaves for Brussels this morning knowing NATO has never faced a test like this. A hot war in Europe with terrifying conventional weapons and the possibility of worse, nuclear, biological, chemical weapons. Now, NATO is not defending a member country, but it has grown unified in the minds of some, surprisingly unified in defense of everything this alliance was created to preserve.
On April 4, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed.
NATO grew out of World War II, a defensive alliance to shield Western Europe from the Soviet Union.
The treaty members realized that real peace is more than an absence of war.
America and Europe also wanted to contain Germany, the aggressor nation in both world wars.
The unofficial purpose, as it was quietly rumored at the time, was to keep the Soviets out, to keep the Americans in, and to keep the Germans down.
In the late 40s, the Soviets controlled East Germany, marking the beginning of the Cold War and NATO's formation.
The United States, together with our allies, will defend every inch of NATO territory.
The key to NATO is Article 5. An attack on one member nation is an attack on the alliance, and all nations must respond in common defense. That kept the peace for decades. In 1979, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, NATO deployed nuclear missiles as a deterrent. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Germany reunified and pan-European peace seemed achievable. Then came 9/11, a new kind of war. NATO came to America's defense, invoking Article 5 for the first time, with NATO forces joining the U.S. in Afghanistan for the next 20 years.
This was an act of great friendship in a time of great need.
In 2004, NATO added 7 former Soviet client states and has gradually expanded since then to its current size of 30 member nations. This expansion alarmed and infuriated Vladimir Putin, who saw NATO, a defensive alliance, as a military and political rival, one that might deprive Russia of global prominence.
I think it was absolutely the right decision to expand.
Kay Bailey Hutchinson was U.S. ambassador to NATO during the Trump administration.
If we hadn't gone out and brought those former Soviet satellite countries in with us, I think they'd be the ones that would be invaded right now.
While it expanded, the alliance drifted. Member nations declined to meet defense spending requirements, an issue pressed by the Obama administration.
If we've got collective defense, it means that everybody's got to chip in.
And amplified by President Trump.
They will have to pay more, frankly. They're going to have to pay more.
They didn't like the tone that President Trump used, of course, but they never, ever said one time that they didn't know they had to do more.
Trump says he helped revive the alliance, though critics said threatening to pull out of it did the opposite. NATO has talked off and on of adding Ukraine, but never did. That's why NATO did not intervene when Putin took Crimea in 2014 and isn't fighting Russia now.
This war is now about Russia taking control of all of Ukraine if it can. If that happens, of course, Ukraine would never become a part of NATO. As we've seen, Ukraine is fighting for its very survival and its future. And if it prevails, it may not need or want common defense protection, or it may want it more than ever. Either way, NATO is not far from the bloody center of this conflict. Guys?
You know, Major, I always love a history lesson from you. And as you know, General Dwight Eisenhower was the first Supreme Allied Commander. And he said in a speech in 1957, "We will in freedom pay any price necessary to preserve freedom." Is NATO still willing to do that?
It appears that it is. And there's one really important part of this process, that reunification of Germany. When Germany reunified, then Secretary of State James Baker said to Mikhail Gorbachev, "If you let Germany reunify on our terms, we won't expand NATO 1 inch to the east." Mikhail Gorbachev said, okay, that's what Putin seizes upon. That was an informal agreement. The actual treaty that did that, though, said NATO could expand. So Putin fixates on that informal process, ignores the actual treaty itself.
Major, thank you. Always a history lesson when you come on the show. We appreciate
The world is watching. Yes, we do.
That's right.